The city was alive as always, humming and restless from dawn until well past midnight. Cars rolled through puddles, voices echoed between glass towers, and people hurried past each other without ever really meeting each other's eyes. In the middle of all that rush was a quiet street called Maple, one of the last corners of the city that still felt human, where old brick buildings leaned close together and a bakery filled the mornings with the smell of warm bread. Ethan lived there, a young man of 27 who preferred quiet over noise and small kindness over grand ambitions. His life followed a gentle rhythm: wake early, pour coffee, lean on the balcony railing, and watch the world stretch awake below him. He worked from home as a designer, a life of screens and silence, creating things that most people scrolled past without noticing. It was a decent life, but it often felt like standing still in the middle of a moving crowd. Across the narrow alley from his balcony was another one, smaller, lined with potted plants and an old wooden rocking chair that had seen too many summers. That was where an elderly woman, Mrs. Green, spent her mornings. She wore her silver hair in a loose bun and wrapped herself in the same soft blue sweater each day. She would sit with a cup of tea and look out over the rooftops as if searching for someone in the distance. Ethan didn't know her well. They exchanged polite smiles, maybe a wave if their eyes met, and that was it. Still, he grew used to her presence. She was part of the view, part of what made Maple Street feel like home. One winter morning, he noticed something strange. Her balcony was empty. The chair still, the teacup missing, the plants untouched. The next day was the same. Then the next. A faint worry grew in him. He told himself it was none of his business, but the thought of her being alone in that apartment wouldn't leave him. On the fourth day he saw a paper taped to the entrance of her building saying the elevator was broken, repairs delayed for a week. He remembered she lived on the fourth floor. He'd seen how slowly she moved, one careful step at a time. How was she managing? That evening he stopped by the grocery store on the corner and bought a small bag of food, bread, milk, fruit, a carton of soup. His heart beat fast as he climbed the narrow stairs to her floor, the smell of old paint and rain following him. At her door he hesitated, then knocked softly. There was the sound of slow footsteps inside, and after a long pause the door opened just a little. Behind it was her face, tired, pale, surprised to see him. She looked as though she hadn't eaten in a day. He explained who he was, just the neighbor from across the street, that he'd noticed she hadn't been out on the balcony and wanted to check if she was all right. She smiled faintly, said she'd been stuck upstairs since the elevator broke, her knee making the stairs impossible. He held up the grocery bag and told her he'd brought a few things. She tried to refuse, then stopped herself and opened the door wider. That was how it started. That first evening he made her tea while she rested in her chair. The apartment smelled of lavender and old books, the kind of scent that carried peace and memory in equal measure. He changed a light bulb for her, helped water the plants that were wilting near the window. Before he left, she thanked him quietly, saying not many young people noticed old women anymore. He smiled and said it was nothing, but inside something felt different, like a small light had been switched on. He didn't know then how much that small gesture would change them both. One visit became two, then three, then a quiet routine. After work he would stop by, bringing small things she might need, and they would talk, or sometimes not talk at all. She told him about her late husband, George, who drove a city bus for 30 years and came home each evening smelling of rain and diesel. She spoke of the dances they shared in their kitchen and of their daughter, Anna, who had moved across the country and rarely called. Ethan listened the way few people do, with patience and stillness. And she noticed. In those evenings the two of them found something unspoken. He gave her company, and she gave him a kind of warmth he hadn't felt since childhood. One rainy night she reached under her chair and pulled out a small box of old letters, the paper yellowed and soft from time. They were written by George during their years together, little notes he'd leave on the kitchen table for her to find in the morning. After he passed away, she had kept writing letters to him out of habit, even though there was no one left to read them. She showed him one, a letter she had never mailed, written in her careful script and addressed simply, "To the one who keeps me company when the world feels quiet." Ethan felt his chest tighten. He didn't need her to say it was about him. In that moment he understood that their shared evenings had become something deeply human, two lives touching quietly, helping each other heal. Winter settled in early that year. Snow drifted past the windows and coated the street like icing sugar. Ethan found himself helping with more and more, picking up medicine, fixing her heater, bringing groceries, decorating her small Christmas tree. They would hum old carols together as he strung the lights. For the first time in years, he felt part of something that resembled a family. But as the weeks passed, Mrs. Green grew weaker. Her steps slowed, her voice grew faint. One night she didn't answer when he knocked. He called her name softly. Still nothing. Panic rose in him. The building manager opened the door, and they found her asleep in her chair, breathing shallowly. The ambulance came, and Ethan rode with her through falling snow, holding her hand as the sirens echoed against the buildings. At the hospital she told him not to look so worried, that she was tougher than she looked. He stayed beside her bed all night, listening to the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the distant sounds of nurses walking the halls. In that sterile light he thought about how their lives had crossed by chance, about how easily people in a city of millions could become invisible until someone cared enough to look closer. As dawn crept through the window, he promised himself he would keep showing up, no matter what happened next. The days that followed felt longer than they should have. Ethan went to work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the hospital room where Mrs. Green lay resting beneath a blanket too thin for the cold. Each evening he stopped by with small things that might make her feel less alone, a new book, a scarf, a cup of her favorite tea in a travel mug still steaming. Sometimes she was awake, sometimes asleep, but always she smiled when she realized he had come. The nurses began to know him by name. One of them said the visit seemed to make her stronger, that her heart rate lifted whenever he walked in. He didn't know how to respond to that, he just kept coming back. One evening, when the light outside had turned golden and the hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, she asked him to open the drawer of the bedside table. Inside was a faded photograph of a small house with a white fence. She told him it was the home she and her husband had bought decades ago, not far from the coast. They had dreamed of retiring there, but life had taken different turns. She had sold it after George died, but she still kept the picture near because it reminded her that dreams don't disappear just because they change shape. She looked at him with tired eyes and said that everyone needs someone to remind them that they are still allowed to dream. Then she closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep. Ethan stayed in the chair beside her until the room lights dimmed. In the following weeks she slowly improved. The doctor said rest and medication were helping, but Ethan believed something else was at work, something about connection and care. When she was finally allowed to go home, he helped pack her few belongings and walked beside her up the steps of her building. The elevator was fixed now, but she said she wanted to take the stairs, just to feel them under her feet again. She laughed halfway up and told him not to look so alarmed. Back in her apartment, the plants drooped and the air smelled stale, but within hours it was alive again. They sat on the balcony together as the sun fell between the buildings and for a while neither spoke. The city lights came on one by one, soft as candle flames, and Ethan felt something in his chest unclench. Over the next months he kept visiting. What had begun as help with groceries turned into a deep friendship. He told her about his parents, how his mother used to hum while making breakfast, how his father had taught him to fix broken things. He admitted that after they passed, he had felt adrift, living quietly so he wouldn't have to miss anyone. Mrs. Green listened and smiled the way only someone much older can, as if she saw the boy he used to be hiding behind the man he had become. Sometimes she would give him small pieces of advice in passing, things like never leave kindness unsaid, or there's more healing in company than in solitude. He found himself repeating those words on days when work felt pointless and the world seemed too loud. One morning in early spring she called him from her balcony, her voice faint but excited. She had baked bread, the first time since before her illness, and wanted him to try it. He crossed the street and found the kitchen full of warmth and the smell of butter. They ate in silence, and he realized that joy could be as simple as shared bread on a quiet afternoon. Afterward she handed him a small envelope. Inside was a folded note, written in the same graceful script as the old letters she once showed him. It said that she wanted him to have something, a gift she had been preparing for some time, but that he shouldn't open it yet. She told him there would be a right moment for it, and he would know when. He nodded, curious but respectful, and slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket where it stayed for weeks. Life carried on gently. The seasons turned, and Maple Street grew green again. Ethan got busier with work, but he always found time for their evening tea. He began fixing up little things around her apartment, patching the paint on the walls, oiling the balcony chair so it would stop creaking. She teased that he was turning into a handyman, and he said she was turning into his favorite client. There was laughter in their days again, soft but constant. Then, one cloudy afternoon, everything changed. He arrived to find the door slightly open and the lights off. The quiet inside was heavy, different from sleep. On the table lay a note written in her careful hand, short and steady. It said she had been admitted again, that it was nothing serious, and she didn't want him to worry. She added that if he could, he should come by the hospital when he had time. He did, that same evening, heart-thudding. When he entered her room she was sitting up, looking out the window at the city skyline washed in gray. She smiled when she saw him, but he noticed the tiredness behind her eyes. They talked quietly about small things, weather, the neighbors, a movie he'd seen. Before leaving, he reached for her hand and she squeezed his fingers gently. She told him to keep living fully, to promise her he wouldn't retreat back into silence if she wasn't around. He tried to laugh it off, but she held his gaze until he nodded. She said good, that was all she needed. A few days later she slipped into sleep and did not wake again. The news came early in the morning, a nurse calling him because he was listed as her emergency contact. For a long time he just sat by the window of his apartment, watching the city move on as if nothing had happened. He hadn't realized how much of his daily rhythm had been built around her presence, the tea, the small errands, the balcony wave. The world felt suddenly wider, emptier, and strangely quiet. Then he remembered the envelope she had given him and reached for his jacket. He opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small key. The letter began with his name and told him that by the time he read it, she would likely be gone. She thanked him for his kindness, for noticing her when the world didn't, and said he had reminded her that love doesn't end just because people leave, it keeps traveling in the things we do for others. The key, she explained, was to a safety deposit box at the local bank. She wrote that there was something there meant for him, something she hoped would carry the kindness forward. The next day Ethan went to the bank, the letter folded neatly in his pocket. Inside the small metal box was a single envelope and a deed. The deed was for a small coastal house, the same one from the photograph she had once shown him. In the letter she explained that she had bought it back a few years ago when she learned it was up for sale again, and that she wanted him to have it, to use it as a place for rest and creativity, a haven for anyone who might need it. She ended by writing that generosity is the only investment that never fails, and she trusted him to keep it alive. Ethan sat there in silence, holding the letter, feeling the air in the vault thick around him. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. He just whispered a thank you to no one in particular. Ethan drove to the coast a week later, the deed still folded in his jacket pocket like a promise he hadn't yet understood. The road stretched long and quiet, bordered by fields that rolled into the horizon. When he reached the address, the house stood just as the picture had shown, white fence, weathered porch, a small garden of wildflowers growing freely in the wind. The sea was only a short walk away, its sound a low hum that seemed to fill the air with calm. He stepped inside and found everything simple but cared for, wooden floors, curtains that breathed with the breeze, a kitchen that smelled faintly of salt and thyme. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a framed photograph of Mrs. Green and her husband, smiling in front of a city bus. Beside it was another envelope with his name. Inside was a short note that said only, "This is where new stories begin." He stayed for a few days at first, telling himself it was just to tidy up, to decide what to do with the place. But the stillness there began to settle inside him. Each morning he walked along the beach, watching the sun rise like a slow exhale, and thought about how many people pass through life without ever realizing how deeply small acts of care can reach. In that quiet, he began to design again, but differently this time. Not for clients or deadlines, but for meaning. He painted, wrote short stories, even planted a small vegetable patch behind the house. He thought of her with each new seed he pressed into the soil, each wall he repainted. It was as if every brushstroke was a way of saying thank you. Months turned into a year. The house became a refuge not just for him but for others. He began inviting people who needed a break from the noise of the city, friends, co-workers, sometimes strangers who had nowhere to go. He never charged them anything. He told them the place was a gift, passed from one act of kindness to another, and that their only task was to leave it a little better than they found it. Some stayed for a weekend, some for weeks. A musician wrote his first song there. A young couple restored the garden fence. A teacher who had lost her husband said it helped her learn to smile again. Every corner of the house began to collect stories, layers of gratitude woven quietly into the air. Ethan often imagined Mrs. Green sitting by the window, watching the waves, maybe smiling to herself knowing what her simple act of generosity had set in motion. He sometimes read her old letters aloud to the wind, as if she might hear them carried across the sea. In doing so, he felt less alone. He realized that grief doesn't vanish, it transforms into memory, and memory, if cared for, becomes love still moving through the world. Years later, on the anniversary of her passing, he returned to Maple Street. The city had changed, shinier and louder than before, but the old building still stood. He looked up at her balcony and saw it empty but somehow alive in his mind's eye, the blue sweater, the rocking chair, the gentle smile. He placed a small pot of lavender by the entrance, the same kind she used to grow, and whispered a quiet thank you before walking away. The street felt different now, as if the noise had softened for a moment to make space for the memory of kindness. Back at the coastal house that night, he sat by the fire and opened his notebook. He began to write, not about loss, but about the miracle of being seen. About how a young man and an elderly woman, separated by decades, had changed each other's world simply by caring. He wrote about the power of small gestures, about how help given without expectation has the strength to echo far beyond its moment. And as he wrote, he realized this was what she had meant when she said this is where new stories begin. It wasn't about the house or the gift. It was about continuing the change she had started, one kind act leading quietly to another. He started a small foundation in her name, dedicated to helping elderly residents in the city who lived alone. It began modestly, delivering groceries, fixing broken heaters, organizing volunteers to check in on those who had been forgotten. But as more people heard the story, it grew. Donations came in. Communities formed around it. What began as one neighbor helping another became a movement that touched hundreds of lives. And through it all, Ethan remained humble, saying it wasn't his idea, that he was simply carrying forward a lesson given to him long ago in a small apartment on Maple Street. On quiet evenings he still returned to the balcony of the coastal house, tea in hand, watching the sun sink into the sea. The wind would rustle the leaves, and he'd imagine her voice in it, gentle and amused. Sometimes he would close his eyes and picture the city, the balcony, the old rocking chair, and he would feel a warmth that no distance could fade. He knew that love given freely never truly leaves, it just finds new homes to live in. And as he sat there, surrounded by the sound of waves and the faint scent of lavender from the garden, he felt at peace. The city lights were far away now, but their reflections still shimmered across the water, like small reminders of every kindness ever shared. Ethan smiled to himself and whispered into the dusk that he finally understood. The beautiful gift was never the house, nor the deed, nor even the legacy. It was the chance to love and be loved without asking why. It was the reminder that the simplest act, knocking on a neighbor's door, offering a helping hand, can become the start of something far greater than either person could imagine. The ocean breeze swept through the open window, carrying the faintest echo of laughter, and the story of Maple Street continued, not in memory, but in every act of quiet goodness that still rippled outward into the world.